Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Resident Evil Vendetta. So, I, of course, have only just, I've seen some Resident Evil movies in my time. It might not showcase that upon this channel because I've just mainly seen and reviewed the first one. But, going into this, that doesn't make me at all a Resident Evil expert. I have seen certain playthroughs and certain things of the other kind of Resident Evil stuff, but again, that makes me no expert. Um, I just kind of came in here because I ended up seeing this and I was like, okay, this is kind of a unique experience because, evidently I ended up finding out that Resident Evil ended up having some animated films, and so I was like, okay, this might be like a unique thing to eventually talk about here. So I don't know. I just kind of went off to this to see where eventually this might head, especially with Resident Evil eventually getting a reboot movie called Welcome to Raccoon City. I kind of felt that eventually it's going to become more and more of a thing to eventually just start talking about some Resident Evil stuff, because I think it was a kind of a no brainer to eventually go into some animated stuff that eventually this was to otherwise provide me. So going into this, I think that in this movie we have characters called Leon and Rebecca, and I know in the remake Resident Evil game, Leon I think is to be in that game, and I think Rebecca might have been an alternate choice. I think a lot of people, when I would see playthroughs, a lot of people I think ended up choosing Leon first, I think a lot, or just choosing Leon, I think, for whatever reason. But but yeah, so but in this movie we don't have an actual 100% tie of the Umbrella Corporation. We really just have it an own little curved story about a guy named Glenn Arias, who is to eventually uh, take it upon himself to uh, eventually go and have his own bioweapon that is to be similar to the Umbrella Corporation's, and eventually wipe out everyone, because eventually somebody had gone against him and wiped him, uh, or tried to wipe him out and his family at a certain gathering, which we'll get into in spoilers. So, really interesting film. It's been a while since I've seen Resident Evil stuff, so this is kind of me being reintroduced back into it. And this has some kind of cool action. When we end up having Resident Evil things, they really try to be drastically different than anything that you've seen. We have Leon, who has these goofy gun angles that he has to maneuver with his gun, and that just looked so odd. Uh, we also, of course, have to remember that this is still a zombie apocalypse. And not only that, what makes it worse is we also have dogs that are to eventually become these zombie-esh dogs. And we just have Leon, who's just driving around in this motorcycle, just man, I think I'll get by with eventually not having dogs come and attack me at some point. Uh, but yeah, so this movie is to be much more of a side mission kind of thing, where we eventually have uh, kind of our heroes eventually being forced back into town and have to eventually try and fight out this zombie invasion. But yeah, and plus we also seemingly are to come up with a cure, quite possibly, of the bio weapon. So that creates kind of an interesting film here. And so I think that's all that I wanted to say about Resident Evil Vendetta. So even though I felt like I've seen a cluster of the Resident Evil movies, like there isn't much that uh, I feel is like drastically unique from this experience. Plus, if you kind of watch the Resident Evil games and then you also watch this animated movie, it's not like a huge like gap of whatever, because this animated movie is built like a video game where you have to have like the final boss and whatever. So like these people probably could have come up with this just being a game, but eventually I guess they decided it's like, oh well, how about we just go on and just like have this be an animated movie instead, so we can kind of continue to try to siphon off some money from this. So like basically this is just a ton of cutscenes just done as a film basically. So with that said, let me know in the comments below if you are a Resident Evil video game fan, if they basically ripped and copied and whatever off of any of the other Resident Evil games to put together this story. Let me know in the comments below if you are interested in either the Raccoon City remake movie, because that looked really good. I was really interested about that. I'm like, oh good, so we're also going in like a clean slate kind of direction also, where it feels like instead of just going to mainly focus on one girl who is to be like this super powered individual from the last franchise, we're now going back to having there seemingly be more of a group kind of process of things. And it seems like they're trying much more to give this kind of thing a different approach than going and doing like the video game kind of thing. So it'll be interesting to see if eventually out of this spurns a video game, or eventually it might be a multiplayer Resident Evil game. That would be really cool. I would love to see that as a playthrough for a lot of people, to do like a multiplayer Resident Evil thing. That'd be really cool. So with that said, let's just go into spoilers about this one, because it's either you're interested or you're not interested. It's either you're a Resident Evil fan if you've never heard of this in your life and you're like, what is Raccoon City? What is that Raccoon City? Never heard of it. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, very beginning of this movie, we weirdly kind of have this like scene that like it just feels like we kind of like plop these characters, and then eventually we just kind of continue on. Just like they eventually give you the story, but it also like there are obvious points when a lot of people could just debate that this just feels like a cutscene movie. Because there's points in time where like not everything connects with one another smoothly. Because at the very beginning of this film, we have Leon, who's to be walking into this morgue and like, I never thought that when I'd have gotten older that I would have had to have gone and done things like this. Where all of a sudden we have this body bag of this morgue that ends up kind of popping up, and Leon shoots it, and then the body bag falls back over. And so, like, we have that weird, goofy intro, and then we transition to eventually having Chris with a number of these, like, commando-esque, like, characters who we have, like, Alejandro, and DC, and a number of other characters, Damien, and so on and so forth. We have a lot of these characters eventually all going to this house where we have this one soldier that's going to Chris and saying like, "Hey man, I guess you're the hero. You're the you're the man of this thing. You're the guy that's kind of like been like the key guy to this whole ordeal. Like you're the specialist. Ooh wow, look at you." And so Chris is just like, "Well, yeah, about that. It's like, you know what, when you're kind of forced to be put in this kind of position, like you have friends, right? Like you have family, right?" And this guy's like, "Well, yeah." And so Chris is like, Well, guess what? Like, when you're forced in this kind of position, you're probably eventually going to see your friends eventually turn. You're eventually going to see your closest family turn. And eventually you're going to have to put a bullet to those people. Eventually you're going to have to make the tough decision and be forced to come to a thought process of whether or not you can really easily pull that trigger or not. And so the guy's like, well, true, true. So eventually they are to land. We have this guy who's giving them the stats of what they're going into. So they're, of course, going after this guy named Glenn, who is to seemingly be the villain in this situation. And so they're going into a house that had supposedly been owned by Kathy White with her child, Zach White. And so they're just to kind of be on the lookout to eventually see if there's eventually going to be a zombie invasion in here. So kind of just check things out, and eventually you just kind of go through the home to just kind of see if they're still there or not, if they're safe, if they're dead, or if they're whatever. So eventually they are to go into this building, and so there are to be certain soldiers that are to eventually kind of go and like like we have this kind of slow build to just be like, oh man, what's gonna happen, where is this gonna play out. We have Alejandro who has his people, and we have Chris who has his people, and there's also, I guess, to be a third group kind of like searching. So Alejandro is to have his people, and eventually what ends up playing out with that is we have one of the zombies with half of his body gone, eventually coming out of this chimney and eventually attacking Alejandro's people and killing them all off. Two of these guys are to eventually run off into this hallway to eventually get all chopped up because we end up finding out that there's a bunch of these like piano-ish like strings that all of a sudden are to be like slicing through all these people, or it's something like much more aggressive than that. I'm not quite sure, but either way. So that was some kind of like stringed esh like trap that they have there. If there's at all any kind of Resident Evil specifics about any of this stuff, let me know in the comments below. Definitely, if there's any comparisons to any of these characters that anyone could make about Resident Evil stuff because they've played the games, they've seen the movies, they've whatever. Let me know down in the comments below. There's probably a bunch of Resident Evil fans that know a bunch of stuff that I don't, of course, because I'm just a person that is to just kind of go in here blind and not have to make like, oh, let's make 100 comparisons to like trying to like I'm just kind of going this and just enjoying whatever this is to be laid out. So eventually there's to be this one bed that is to have this motorized bike that all of a sudden is to continue to move. And so these one soldiers are like, hey, why is this thing continuing to move? All of a sudden we end up having Zach White, who ends up coming out of the shadows, and he's coming out of the shadows with his head kind of dropped down so they can't see what if this kid is zombified or not. So they're like, hey kid, you alright? And then he like pokes his head up to show that he's a zombie, and then he starts munching and killing all these guys. So of course they in turn turn into zombies. So eventually, now that all these guys are basically dead, we have Chris, who eventually goes back to the room where there is to be this bed with this motorcycle or motorcycle, this truck that's motorized. So Chris goes back in that room. He goes in the bed, looks at the sheets, sees the truck. So eventually, we're just thinking the same thing's going to happen twice, but instead, it seems that I think Chris is to be dragged underneath the bed, and all of a sudden we end up seeing these like zombies kind of popping around these beds, like ah, like so. Chris is like firing away, and so everybody's just trying to like crazily make their defense, but everyone is to die, but Chris. Chris ends up going, and well, there's to be one soldier that he kind of tells him to get the heck out of there, tosses a grenade in the room, runs out, and so eventually this guy ends up starting to turn, and so now Chris ends up putting a bullet to this guy's head and has to kill him because he turned. So Chris goes out of this place realizing that no one is there, that basically this was just a booby trap to kill all these guys off. So eventually Chris heads outside of the place to eventually find Glenn there, and Glenn is basically with his army of like he basically has Diego Gomez, which is this huge like Bane like character that is be like this like massive Hulk like character. We have Diego's daughter there that is to seemingly be this very pale looking girl. And so Glenn is to, of course, now like kind of tell us that like Glenn isn't going to be easily defeated. And so we have Glenn who is to tell Chris that basically he has control over these bioweapon characters. And so now Glenn isn't, of course, going to get attacked via these bioweapons because he knows they know who their master is or who their like ally is, and so he doesn't have to worry about getting killed. So, which I guess is really really smart. Like, couldn't they have come up with some kind of long distance weaponry like thing to eventually have like zombies kind of being controlled so that way like they eventually would stop going after humans and all of a sudden just like if someone was to like mind control them or some kind of device or something to all of a sudden curve who they are to be attacking, wouldn't that be an interesting movie where all of a sudden you have zombies under control of someone? Like they could kind of like rig that somehow to just like just have the science of it just be like, hey, like it would be interesting. But anyways, so but the real important thing of this is that Kathy is eventually had been zombified, and so now she's going and attacking Chris. And while Kathy's doing that, all the guys are just kind of walking off because they're like, meh, like we'll just leave Chris to freaking be killed by Kathy. So, because eventually um, Chris had been injured. So basically, what more reason to eventually just have Kathy just try to go after him? But luckily enough, Chris eventually was to get saved, and so now we eventually transition to go and talk about Rebecca. So Rebecca is to now be in this lab where she is to be with this guy named Aaron, who is to have gotten her coffee, and maybe there's something I'm missing here. Like maybe I should get into Glenn's backstory before I get to the. It doesn't matter. Let's go into this. So, because this is a long stretch of a story, let's go into the Glenn stuff and then we'll go back to Rebecca because the Glenn part is a shorter story, and I know I might be jumping all over the place. Get ready for that because it's bound to happen. So. But this is a flashback, so it doesn't matter when I say it. It's just already happened anyways. So we find out that the reason why Glenn has a vendetta against seemingly Chris and all the people that work with Chris is basically because Glenn was to have had a wedding with a girl named Sarah. And so Glenn is to have, I guess, had this kind of after wedding thing, and they're having this like party or something like that afterwards. Like basically everybody's clinking glasses and like, yeah, like great wedding. Woo, great wedding. When do weddings suck? I don't know. But anyways, so all of a sudden there's this drone that ends up coming into Glenn's wedding, dropping this like this bazooka like weapon, this like rocket like weapon, supposedly to kill Glenn, and it doesn't. It kills everyone else but Glenn. And so Glenn is now revenge. No, because he ends up getting out of the rubble, and he is to be holding onto his wife's hand still, because he was holding onto her hand, and then all of a sudden, like the bomb happened, and so now all that's left of Sarah is just her hand, and he's like, "No hand, I will get you, whoever did this," while I'm smacking my wife's hand all around. No. So now that that's covered, because eventually that hand is going to come back in handy when eventually we talk about something later. So let's go back to Rebecca. So Rebecca, Aaron, exchanging coffee recipes, because evidently Rebecca is to be putting in like whipped cream and chocolate chips into her coffee, and so Aaron is to just be like, well, that's not a coffee, that's a dessert. Like, man, that really seems really unhealthy. And so, in my mind, I'm thinking, like, how is even Rebecca drinking this thing? Like, how is she drinking the whipped cream part? How is she drinking the chocolate chips part? Because that makes no sense. Like, she's drinking this thing, but it's from a thing that has, like, a tiny hole. How can you be drinking this coffee right now? Did they not think of that when they were writing the story? But like, I guess like they were like try to build up that like Rebecca just really needs her energy to eventually come up with the cure of the zombie whatever thing. So weirdly enough, so eventually Aaron was to go on and try to get to something, and so all of a sudden we have a gas of uh, of the Resident Evil zombie thing eventually come in to turn everyone in this laboratory into a zombie. All of a sudden Rebecca is tasting the fumes or tasting the gas of this zombie creating thing, because supposedly they had mentioned that there are numerous ways to release this virus. There's to be this one like trigger virus where I guess you can kind of because supposedly they eventually say that everyone on Earth is to supposedly be able to have this ability to eventually become this zombie, because I guess Glenn at some point had put this concoction through the water supply. So I'm like, man, you could never trust drinking water out of a sink. Like, I don't know how many movies where they're like, hey, never drink from a sink. Like, Batman Begins will tell you that. like you might get some fear toxin in you. Like, never drink from a sink again. Like, Cabin Fever will tell you to never drink from a sink. Like, good God. Like, man, I'm never going to trust my sink again. I'm just going to be washing my hands and just the whole time just like, I could die. It could possibly happen right now. I could die. So, because so many of these movies put that fear in you. So, but yeah, they're just saying that there's different kinds of ways to either gas somebody or have this trigger like thing, or I think there's like a third option, weirdly. They have to go into like a whole thing of talking about that to, I guess, make it seem like there's a much more complicated way of eventually someone becoming a zombie. So, but yeah, so Rebecca is to eventually feel the gas in this laboratory, and so eventually she is to before she turns, she coincidentally ends up finding the cure of this whole thing at the last minute. She goes and psst, her freaking wrist with some kind of medical device, and she ends up becoming cured of this whole thing. And she's like, "Yeah, I came up with a cure. Yeah." So like this vaccine that eventually she's like tossing it out to everybody, just like, "Hey man, like here's your vaccine. Like you're gonna be feeling great, I'm sure, right?" So like after you get this whole vaccine inside of you, so Rebecca of us is of course having to go through this laboratory and eventually having to take a fire extinguisher to someone's head. I think it's Aaron's. So she's having to like beat his head to death with this fire extinguisher. And you would have thought that the girl would have kept the fire extinguisher around with her because eventually she has to start seeing other zombies, and so she's going to have to run around this laboratory. Well, conveniently, we eventually have Chris and all of his men eventually go on to eventually go and like save Rebecca. And so after they end up saving her, they end up kind of taking her into the plane where we kind of get this backstory about her, where I think Nadia is kind of asking her, it's like, well, hey, like, it seems like you and Chris do have some kind of history with one another. Like, so, like, were you always just a lab rat? And so, seeing that Rebecca was to have been a person on the ground, but then she ended up transitioning into eventually becoming a lab rat or kind of a scientist. Uh, Kind of just because like she thought like that was the best place that she could have really been used. So because luckily she came up with this cure, right? So eventually that leads us to eventually having Chris meet up with Leon, and so now they're gonna go and talk to him to try to get him um, tied to this whole ordeal. So eventually, what ends up kind of transpiring is that eventually Glenn is to eventually with his people make their way to where Chris, Leon, and Rebecca are, because there's to be this guy named Patricio who is to have led Glenn here because this guy had his wife getting threatened to be killed off if Patricio wasn't to give it or divulge this information. And so I think we end up having Diego make his way here to eventually try and take down these characters. And so what ends up happening is Rebecca ends up getting taken, and then eventually we have Rebecca going and meeting up with Glenn, and Glenn is to eventually mention to Rebecca that, like, hey, like, coincidentally, you are to look exactly like my Sarah. Wow, what a huge coincidence, right? It's not like they just carved up that story to eventually push, like, this person to look just like Sarah and just like Rebecca. Like, wow, what a coincidence, right? But honestly, with Resident Evil, like, when you really look at the video games, it kind of does look like everybody looks the freaking same. Like there's only a limited way of everyone to be looking like us. So like it's probably much more a coincidence that people are to look the same because most of the time they actually do. So I don't know what it is. Like it's just done that way. So uh so we just have it to where Glenn is to tell Rebecca that since Rebecca is to look so much like his wife, they're just going to do the wedding all over again. And this time around, uh, Rebecca is going to be Glenn's wife. And so Rebecca is just like, well, it's like, you need my consent to kind of do that. And Glenn is just like, well, if anything, I can just give you my wife's arm. And eventually I can control you that way. And maybe you'll be more accepting of this whole thing. And I'm like, that's kind of weird. Like, that, like, body part. Like, I don't know how that body part has been so reserved over this stretch of time. And I don't quite get how like reattaching that arm will all of a sudden just make Rebecca Sarah for some reason. It just doesn't quite make sense, but I guess it is what it is. So, uh, because Rebecca is in this wedding gown, obviously telling us that like Rebecca is going to be Glenn's wife. So eventually what ends up coming to pass is that Glenn is to also go into the city and release these gas tankers on Raccoon City. And so now Leon and Chris are kind of teaming up together to eventually go into the town and are to eventually try to help people, and are trying to eventually kind of take out these tankers so that way this gas doesn't continue to spread to people. So we have, of course, where I guess the guys didn't have much of equipment, so all they had is like one Humvee and one motorcycle, and Leon's like, I'm taking that. So we eventually seek like dogs and all kinds of stuff, all kinds of zombie characters in this situation. And so eventually they're kind of doing their best to eventually try and mitigate the situation and eventually like take out these tankers and stuff like that to try to give people relief. But eventually they take this out, so we transition and to, of course, now Leon and Chris having to get into this building to, of course, try to get to Rebecca, because that's the goal. So eventually when Chris and Leon are to eventually make it into this building to make their way up to Rebecca, we eventually have that Rebecca is to be re-given a thing that is going to make her zombified yet again. And supposedly Glenn is to mention it's like, well, it's going to take 30 minutes to hold, or it's going to take 30 minutes and then you're going to become zombified again. So before Rebecca was to go and get captured, Rebecca ends up giving Chris and Leon her blood to just be like, hey guys, like if you want a cure of this, like just take my blood. And you guys are going to have to mass produce this and kind of go to some other laboratory and eventually give them the cure of this. So like kind of give them the cure so that way they can kind of resolve all this. So they end up kind of making their way through this building, both Leon and Chris. So eventually, of course, we have Leon with his weird, goofy shooting angles of things. But eventually Leon is to continue with his motorcycle through this entire building, seemingly, which I just thought that was weird. But we eventually have, of course, Leon, who is to have to go and deal with Diego at some point. And we eventually have Chris, who is to eventually have to go and fight out Glenn. And I think the weirdest part of this movie is eventually when like Chris is kind of shooting around these like metal fences, and then eventually he gets so close to Glenn that we have this like weird moment where they're to do these like weird acrobatic like moves to eventually being shot like 1 foot away from one another. where it's just this weird, like, juggling, dancing thing that they're bizarrely doing because they are so absurdly close to one another that they're trying to, like, dance their way or flip their way around to eventually avoid being shot, considering they're so close to one another. Like, they're like face to face basically with one another, avoiding getting shot. It looks so goofy, but like I'm just like, well, I guess that makes sense for them flipping flopping around, but it still just seems so weird. Um, they could have eventually just disarmed one another and eventually just had to like go into like actual fighting. So eventually we have Leon, who eventually is to, of course, go and seemingly take down Diego, and is to eventually make his way up to, of course, where Chris is. And so Chris and Glenn are fighting, and eventually we have this kind of breaking glass like moment where it seems like this glass is absurdly strong. And so they're kind of bashing themselves into this glass. And so Chris ends up going and taking Glenn and tossing him into, I guess, the perfect spot of where all this glass is to eventually finally break. And so Glenn ends up falling seemingly hundreds and hundreds of feet down, which I'm like, I'm sorry, I've seen Dread, and that seems to be a pretty far jaunt down. I'm like, wouldn't this guy not have any kind of bodily pieces left to him? Like, wouldn't that just be, like, just spray at that point? I don't know. I guess I don't really understand the real true impact of a body from seemingly tons and tons of feet from glass to ground. So they might have actually assumed that they had won here and they're kind of high-fiving. They're like, yeah. So eventually there is to be a 20-minute timer that Chris is to eventually have when Glenn is to tell Chris that Rebecca is infected. So we have it where Chris is to eventually go and find this weird, goofy tank device to give to Rebecca to eventually heal her from her zombified state. So eventually that works out. But eventually Glenn is to go to Diego and tell him, it's like, hey man, final stage. We have to like put together this final stage of things. So Diego is to rip off his metal mask and toss it onto the ground. And so Diego weirdly is to like detach his back because Diego is to kind of like every metal piece that's on him is to just kind of break free. So we find out that both Glenn and Diego are now sharing one body. And I'm like, okay, this is so weird. But it's Resident Evil, so what difference does it make? It's always weird when it goes down to Resident Evil. So now Glenn slash Diego is to be an even more larger, that's not a word, larger being. And so now we just have it where like these two characters have these weird weapons that they didn't even have before, but now they do. Like we just have it where reasonably I'll just call him like mutated Glenn. That'll be the easiest thing to just call this thing. So mutated Glenn is to just kind of go and grab like either Chris or Leon by like the waist and just kind of squeeze them. And so eventually it seems like they're trying to defend, of course, this monstrous being off. we end up having one point where eventually mutated Glenn is grabbing onto Leon and is going to eventually go and have these like nails or needles coming out of this guy's fingertips. And so I'm just like, okay, that's weird. That's so weird. Um, because like this isn't like Wolverine, but I guess like with the Resident Evil like big monster, like a Resident Evil monster can basically do almost anything, anyways. So what really happens here is eventually we have this huge like chopper that kind of comes out of nowhere, or like it's a mix between like a helicopter and a plane. Like it's like a plane chopper. The kind of, I don't know the exact military-ish like word for that, but we have, let's just call it a plane because that's what it seems to look like, but it's like a hovering plane. So this plane ends up coming out of nowhere, and it's just start firing upon this thing to kind of even the odds. And so now all of a sudden, uh, we have mutated Glenn who's attacking the plane and trying to take it down and trying to tear it down. And so all of a sudden, Leon is to uh, fly from the skyscraper and take this motorcycle and shove it into the mutated Glenn, and to eventually kind of explode, I guess, the gas tank to eventually have Glenn kind of like get killed off here. And so he does, and that's how they kind of eventually take this character out. So now we end up having it to where who is to be next that is to technically take the mantle. And so eventually we stumble upon that. Where is her? We have Maria, who is to eventually go and grab onto her father's metal mask and just be like, oh yeah, I'm going to take up the mantle. Like, you bet I'm going to be back. Which I don't know. I don't know what happens in the other films, but we'll kind of see how this all plays out. Eventually, if there's other things that attach or a tie or whatever or otherwise gets further on into these movies. But yeah, so eventually things are to seemingly be a success with all of this, all these characters. I don't think there's anything much left after to just kind of say about any of these things. So with that said, I think I'm going to get out of here. Don't quite understand how exactly all this came to be or came out, but it's a review. I probably didn't get into the perfect specifics of everything, because I watched like most of this like the night before, and then I just finished up watching it like today. And so like immediately there's like, and I also watched like certain kind of movies and certain kind of episodes and certain kind of whatever. So tried my best, but with that said, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.